It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us is Lisa Everett, Director of the Family and Pro-Life Office for the Diocese of Fort Wayne-South Bend, here to talk to us about Ava's Grace Ministry. Thanks for being here, Lisa.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.
Can you talk a little bit about what Ava's Grace is and why you decided to form this ministry for the diocese?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Ava's Grace is a new ministry, and the purpose of it is to provide emotional and spiritual and practical support for family suffering, miscarriage, stillbirth, and any kind of infant loss. Our granddaughter, Ava Madeline Lobo, for whom the ministry is named, was stillborn at full term May 17th, 2016. And it was the most difficult event our family ever faced. And kind of based on that experience of having tried to help our son-in-law and daughter, Kate and Dale, Ava's parents, to grieve that tremendous loss, as well as our entire family, just seeing that the beauty of bringing the resources of our faith to bear on that. You know, everything from a naming ceremony, a funeral liturgy, that were so helpful for Kate and Dale in particular and our family as a whole, and really feeling the call in my heart last fall to start something really in honor of Ava. Mm-hmm. And having thought and prayed about it for months last fall, just felt like I got a clear confirmation around the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. I had prayed a novena and asked Our Lady to show me what I could do to best honor Ava's life on earth. You know, God always draws good out of our suffering if we give it to Him, and that hopefully other families in our diocese could benefit from what we discovered as a family about how to begin to heal after a loss so enormous like this. So the Church has so much to offer, not only liturgically in our beautiful prayer and funerary tradition, but also beginning to process a loss like that through the lens of our faith. So anyway, that's kind of the origin of it, and I'm very excited that this kind of ministry was able to be incorporated into what we do as a diocese, in particular what marriage and family ministry tries to do to support families in all kinds of situations. And that Bishop Rhodes approved it, and obviously Kate and Dale, Ava's parents, gave us their blessing to move forward and to use her name.
And I think parents might feel alone in these times of loss and feel like, you know, this is a rare thing. And I don't want to minimize the tragedy of this, but unfortunately, this is a very common occurrence for people dealing with miscarriage or stillbirth, or even, like you mentioned, in the first year. Do you have some of the statistics of how common this is?
I do, and again, I would have had no idea of this myself until we had our loss with Ava, but each year in the U.S. alone, about 25,000 babies are stillborn, and approximately the same number of babies die during the first year of life. And then about 15 to 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. That's resulting then in the loss of more than 500,000 babies before 20 weeks gestation. So, you know, technically speaking, a miscarriage is a loss before 20 weeks gestation. A stillbirth is a loss after 20 weeks gestation. So, I mean, that's an enormous number of children and their parents and families who are grieving those losses. And to me, this is just part of what we do as a church, is to reach out and support them. We of all people who believe that every life is sacred from the moment of conception, you know, we really need to surround these grieving parents and families with the kind of support they need at a time when they might feel very much alone. This is kind of a sign of our solidarity in the body of Christ, and a sign of, also to me, the motherly love of the church. St. John Paul II, who's one of my heroes, once wrote that the motherly love of the church consists in being close to people in all that happens to them and bringing their human needs kind of within the radius of Christ's saving power, like Mary did at the wedding at Cana. You know, she's the one who was there and noticed their need and called it to her son's attention, and then let him do the work, right? And so Ava's Grace kind of hopes to be a channel of that motherly love of the church that helps people to bring this terrible suffering and wound of having lost a child and the broken hearts that usually result, to have people turn toward Christ and through the church to help let Him do the work of healing their broken hearts.
We're talking with Lisa Everett from the Diocese of Fort Wayne-South Bend about Ava's Grace Ministry, and you talk about the church and being involved with this, and I feel like the church does a much better job at consoling those that are dealing with loss than maybe society as a whole, myself especially. Mm-hmm. But dealing with loss of a child, especially in the case of a preborn child and a miscarriage or something like that, I feel like we're especially insensitive to as a culture. So in what ways is helping somebody deal with that loss of a child the same or different than, say, the loss of an adult?
Well, I think with expectant parents who lose a child before birth, there's a sense of invalidation that, and I think it's partly, honestly, of the kind of abortion-saturated culture in which we live, that as a culture we don't really acknowledge the existence in a personal way of a child before birth, mm-hmm. and we're kind of saturated in this sense of those losses are minimal. So we don't allow parents to grieve and to own that loss, and we don't acknowledge it as a culture if that child is lost before birth, particularly a miscarriage within the first 20 weeks. Mm-hmm. So I think parents who know what an enormous loss that is, they experience it. You can't deny the grief that they feel, but when that grief is invalidated by others or dismissed, it actually adds to their pain and deepens their sense of loss rather than helping them come to terms with it. Because what you feel as a parent in that situation, I had 2 miscarriages myself, early on in our parenting years. Mm. And especially with our first miscarriage, I can just remember that awful feeling of no one's even going to acknowledge that this child existed.
Right.
So it just deepens your loss to think that no one really acknowledges the pain you feel because they don't acknowledge the person that you're mourning.
What are some things that helped you through that process and maybe have helped your family through the loss of your granddaughter?
It's funny. I think back on I was newly working for the diocese when I realized I was miscarrying our first child. And I had actually had a meeting scheduled with Bishop Darcy in Fort Wayne later that morning. And I was living in South Bend at the time, Fred and I were. So I called the bishop's office and let his secretary know what was happening and that I would not be able to make my meeting with Bishop Darcy. And within 15 minutes, he himself called me back. And I was crying on the phone, and he said to me, which was just something that spoke right to my heart and meant so much to me in that moment. He said, "Lisa, go to Our Lady. She knows what it's like to lose a child."
Wow.
And just those simple words of solidarity, his sensitivity in calling me himself right away, just so he could hear my voice and share with me personally what a loss he knew this was for me, and then to direct me to Our Lady. It was just exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. And I know myself in dealing with the loss of Ava, which is, as a grandparent, it's a double grief, not only grieving the loss of a beloved grandchild, but also being helpless to stand at the foot of the cross of your daughter and son-in-law who are experiencing this terrible tragedy, and there's nothing much you can do to help in that moment. But Our Lady, I felt like I turned to her even more in that moment when Ava had died and in the weeks that followed. And she just she showed up. She became a mother to me in a way that I had never really experienced before. And I felt her consolation. I felt her practical help in figuring out resources and finding out what to do as the weeks and months unfolded and trying to be of help to Kate and Dale. I felt her presence all along in my own life in these losses, and now I want to extend that kind of motherly love that I really felt she showed me on behalf of our whole diocese to other families. I wanted to mention, too, for your listeners that we launched today a whole web page we've put together of all kinds of resources that are practical, spiritual, emotional support, etc. And that site is www.diocesefwsb.org and then /Avas, AVAS-Grace. And we also have some upcoming events, if I could just mention those.
Sure.
Ava's Grace is sponsoring memorial masses for those who have lost a child. Next week, the Fort Wayne area mass will be Tuesday, October 23rd at 7 p.m. at St. John the Baptist in Fort Wayne, and the South Bend area mass will be next Thursday, October 25th at 7 p.m. at St. Therese Little Flower Parish in South Bend. And that parish, as your listeners may know, not only has the relics, or I should say a relic of St. Therese of Lisieux, but also a relic of each of her parents, Louis and Zélie Martin, who themselves lost 4 children, 3 in infancy and 1 in early childhood. So we've picked them as the special patrons of this ministry because their own journey to holiness passed by way of such a painful cross. And we'll also be holding a retreat on Saturday, March 23rd at the Sacred Heart Parish Center, kind of on the edge of Notre Dame's campus, a day-long retreat for couples who have suffered miscarriage, stillbirth, or any kind of infant loss. Because part of the difficulty, too, men and women sometimes tend to grieve differently, and that can be a difficult thing to move through as a couple. And we hope to bring couples together to be able to maybe more intentionally turn towards each other and as a couple toward God in moving through that journey of grief.
And what are some of the other resources that people can find at the website or might be available in the future for group meetings, and maybe what some of the needs are for Ava's Grace?
Our Office of Worship under Brian McMichael has put together all of the rights and things like that that would apply and be particularly comforting to parents who experience any kind of a loss before or after birth. And in particular, there is a norm in which the diocesan bishop can give permission, for example, for a funeral to be celebrated in the home of a child who dies before birth and before baptism, as opposed to in a parish church. And some families might find it more comforting to have a funeral mass like that in the privacy of their own home with maybe close family and friends. So Bishop Rhodes has given permission for that. But we have everything from another colleague, Allison Sturm in the office, went through and made a directory of all the grief support groups that exist in the diocese, and they're listed alphabetically by city. We have a list of funeral homes, again, alphabetical by city, and most of them are willing to really work with parents in a situation like that and offer their services at a reduced cost or even for free. And, for example, our diocesan-owned and operated Divine Mercy Funeral Home in Fort Wayne will provide burial services, a little cloth casket with a silk exterior, graveside services, a granite grave marker in the Garden of Angels section of the Catholic Cemetery in Fort Wayne. Again, all of those services for free for families who have lost a child before or after birth. And they see it as one of their works of mercy, which is, of course, burying the dead, and particularly when a family has to bury a child who they've lost before or after birth. They know the heartache that entails and want to be as supportive as possible. So we have all kinds of resources on there, including mentioning some medical help in the diocese for families who experience a recurrent pregnancy loss. Dr. Chris Stroud, founder of the Fort Wayne Fertility and Midwifery Care Center, his expertise has become helping couples who experience recurrent pregnancy loss. So we've listed him and his information and the testimony of some couples who have been helped by his expertise as well. So there's just a plethora of resources on that page, a lot of blog posts and articles as well. And then we're looking later next spring to launch kind of a companion outreach, which would entail matching women or men or couples with others who have experienced a similar loss. So maybe a couple who's experienced a miscarriage, match them to another couple who's been through that suffering and been able to move forward in their journey of healing, who's been willing to, go through some kind of a training to be able to minister to other couples in that situation. And there's, I think, a beautiful empathy that can be born of a shared suffering and also a shared faith.
All right. Well, again, this is Ava's Grace, which you can find their resources available from the Fort Wayne-South Bend website, diocesefwsb.org. And thank you so much, Lisa Everett, for forming this group and all these resources, putting them all in one place so that people that are dealing with this, an infant loss or miscarriage, that they have these resources. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.